So I'm Doug Shapiro, the director of the Research Center at the National Student Clearinghouse, and I'm very excited to be here today, and I want to thank Kathy and Pat for inviting me, because it's great to have an opportunity to talk to people who really spend time with students and do a lot of the hard work of helping students to reach their goals and to be successful, that we see, as Kathy said, at the Clearinghouse, we see from a real 30,000 foot level. I work with lots and lots of data and very, very few, I guess I would say 0 students, except for my own kids. But the Clearinghouse, so just a really quick background on the Clearinghouse for those of you who may not be so familiar. The Clearinghouse has been around for 23 years now, and we primarily work to serve institutions by collecting and aggregating enrollment data and facilitating the exchange of that data and information, so essentially student enrollment and degree information to enable the institutions basically to focus more on student success, so that your registrars and your IR offices, for the IR folks who are here today, don't have to spend quite so much time submitting data and verifying data and tracking down students. We try to do a lot of that more effectively and more centrally, and make it easier to, in particular, to track students when they transfer and when they move from one institution to another, from one state to another, when they stop out and come back 2 years later, we keep track of them. And that gives us a very different view of higher education as a system and as a whole, and particularly a kind of student view of success. And when the Research Center was created in the Clearinghouse about 6 years ago, we had a slightly different focus, which was to really leverage the information that the Clearinghouse had been collecting for all those years, and focused on, had all these operations focused on very transactional uses of that data, helping to submit compliance reports to the department, for example, or verifications of student enrollment for student loan servicers, that kind of really kind of on the ground thing. But to take advantage of this broader view through research and to provide insights to the education community as a whole into what's really happening in terms of student success. And that research component has been so rewarding because it gives us a way to really show campus practitioners how their students are experiencing and consuming higher education today. And that's a very different way than the kind of traditional way that most of us are familiar with. And we've been able to do this through our published reports, and I'll show you some excerpts from a lot of those reports in a minute, that give a national and state level view of trends and kind of help folks to get their heads around what the patterns and mechanisms are that students are following. But that we are also able, because we have these direct relationships with institutions and their data providers, that we're able to offer institution level kind of comparisons and benchmarks, so that when you see our published reports that tell you how many students nationally or in your state are transferring from a 4-year institution to another 4-year institution, you can drill down and say, well, how does that compare? How do my students compare to that average? And how can I help to contextualize what's happening on my campus or with my students in the context of what's happening in say the last 5 years as a trend, or in my region, or nationally? Are there things that might be going on in the economy or in student demographics that are affecting what I'm seeing on my campus that can help me to tell a better story about student success and student opportunity on my campus. So those things are really important, not just for communicating to prospective students, but also to talking to current students about how to plan better and how to think about their options for mapping out a pathway that will lead them to attain their goals. So this is kind of the 30,000-foot view of how we see mobility and transfer of students in higher education at the Clearinghouse. And I guess that's not quite 30,000 feet high, but it's 1,000 feet. And the point of putting this up here is twofold. One, student pathways are complex. So even the kind of traditional transfer pathway, starting at a community college and moving to a four-year institution, is just a tiny part of it nowadays. Like non-traditional pathways are even less traditional than that. Students are transferring from two-year to other two-year institutions, from four-year to two-year institutions, from four-year to four-year institutions, and there's a lot of kind of transfer in not just among institutions, but among behavior patterns, if you will. Students kind of transferring between full-time and part-time status, and between the workforce and full-time or part-time status, stopping out to take jobs or to serve in the military or to care for family members, parents, children. And so there's a lot going on that you have to kind of be aware of. And unfortunately, while we can kind of see the big picture of those patterns at the Clearinghouse, we see where students go and where they come from, and we see when they pull off the road for a rest stop or a side trip, but we don't really see what's in those cars. Right? So that's kind of the car, but we don't see who that student is very much. We have only very basic demographic information, not a lot of information about that student's goals and aspirations. We don't see what that student is kind of carrying in the trunk. We can't get inside the car and figure out how many credits they have or how many credits they've attempted or what their academic preparation level is. So, the 30,000-foot view has some advantages, but it also has a lot of limitations. And what I want to try and do first today is give you the benefits of some of those advantages, and then by talking about the dimensions of transfer and student mobility. And then we'll talk a little bit about the implications of those transfer patterns for student success and what we see, again, from the 30,000-foot view, but in terms of what are the different success outcomes and graduation rates for different students who follow different pathways, so that we can really start to get down a little bit deeper into what works and what doesn't work. Okay, so first off, this is one of the biggest points that we try to make at the Clearinghouse using our research. If you look at bachelor's degree completions in the United States, all the students who complete a degree in a given year, all the students who start, no, that's right, all the students who start college at a four-year institution, and I take that back. Yeah, start college at a four-year institution. I get confused on this. Start college at a four-year institution and complete a degree within 6 years. Okay? 1/4 of those, so these are all the successful students. Students who start at a four-year institution and graduate within 6 years. Okay? 1/4 of them are graduating somewhere else from where they started. 1/4 of the successful students is somewhere else. And what's important about this is that everything that we know about graduation rates essentially comes from institution-based reporting that you see in iPads. So each of your colleges and universities has an official graduation rate in iPads, the GRS, Graduation Rate Survey. This is what goes into all the college rankings, the scorecard, and as you know, it's pretty limited. It's limited because it only includes first-time, full-time students in the cohort, but what this is saying is that even more important than that, it's limited because it only counts the students who complete at the same place where they started. And so the students and families that you talk to, their view of their kind of odds of success, right? Ideally, when they choose a college, they're looking at your graduation rates and saying, how likely am I to actually finish a degree if I go there rather than the place across town? Right? And what do they have to look at is those iPads graduation rates. And that leads them to think that their chances of graduating are far lower than they really are. Right? So there's a lot of misconception, and it particularly harms students who are not on that traditional pathway. So we think about low-income students, first-generation students, students who don't have adults or community or family who kind of understand how higher education works in this country. If they're looking at all at graduation rates, they're getting a very biased picture. And this is the first part of that. And this is true, as you can see, regardless of whether the students start at a four-year public institution or a private nonprofit institution. It makes almost no difference. It's about 20% of degree completions. For students who start at two-year institutions, so I said a quarter of all, it's a fifth for students at four-year institutions, and it's a third for students who start at two-year institutions. So that's where you get the average of that as a quarter overall. So students who start at two-year institutions, a third of them finish somewhere else. And what you see, so of all the students who finished, about 1 in 12 actually transfer and finish at a different two-year institution, and 1 in 4 finish at a four-year institution. So this is part of this idea that, again, transfer is not just about starting a community college and going to a four-year institution. And there's also, what we're counting here is just students' first completion. So there are students in here, these are all the students who've got an associate's degree from their starting institution, but many of them also then transferred after the associate's degree. And so if you add those into the mix, that's about 16.5%, again, of those who completed a degree will get both an associate's and a bachelor's degree, right? So if you're thinking about the entire student pathway, right, for a student who started at a community college with a goal of getting a bachelor's degree, that associate's degree at the community college is not their ultimate goal, right? So for them, really crossing the finish line is getting to this point where they've finished the bachelor's degree. And so when you put all that together, you're now up to really 50% of the students who started at community college and complete a bachelor's degree, right, are not their pathway to their goal is not fully captured in the standard metrics. And if you think of this a different way, so that's starting with the cohort of students who entered college in a given year. If you look at the cohort of students who graduate at a four-year institution in a given year, regardless of how long ago they started, we find that almost half of them, 46%, had previous enrollments in a community college.
That's pretty significant.
That's very significant, right? But that doesn't mean they started at a community college, right? So this is a different view. They might have started at a four-year institution and gone back to a community college or taken summer courses at a community college We're just counting all the contributions of community colleges to bachelor's awards in a given year, right?
Including students who might have taken community college courses in high school?
Not including, this is not including the dual enrollment students.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is post, yeah.
How do you know? I could have asked that better. Because on our transcript, because I'm at a community college, the concurrent enrollment stuff doesn't look any different to me when I look at it. Does it look different when the data comes to you?
You mean the high school dual enrollment? Yeah, we don't really know. We approximate that based on, well, so for a lot of students, we know when they graduated from high school. And we can just match up the dates and say, if your community college enrollment was before you graduated from high school, we actually have your date of, your high school diploma.
Okay.
And that's for about a third of the high school graduates in the country, because their high schools are sending data to us because they want to track where their students go in college. And for the rest of the students, if we don't actually know when they graduated from high school, we approximate it based on their age. So we say, look, if that enrollment in the community college was before your 18th birthday, we're not going to count that. So it's not perfect, but it's what we got. And you can see how this varies by state, and a lot of this depends on the kind of historic mix of the higher education industry in each state, and a lot of it depends on state policies and articulation, all sorts of things. But in Texas here, it's 70%, California 62, 66 in Wyoming, and generally you can see it's higher in the south and west, and it gets lower in the northeast, where community colleges have less of a kind of role in the system overall traditionally. So that in New York it's 35%, Massachusetts it's only 24%.
Doug, this is on the flash drive?
This is what?
Information on the flash drive?
Yes.
Yeah, the whole PowerPoint is on the flash drive, yeah. Yeah, and all,
So that's like now out in the packet.
yeah. And everything, all of these results are actually coming straight from the reports that we have published that are all available for free download on the Clearinghouse Research Center website as well. So I'll show you a link at the end. But we don't even ask you to give us your email address or sign in or log in or anything. You just go to our website and you can download any of our reports at any time. Yeah?
Our provost is talking about our institution's 6-year rate, and yet you point out that he maybe looked at it in a broader way and have maybe, is there an adjusted institutional rate that actually, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, there are a lot, right. There are, and one of the ones that we talk about is, so the standard is a 6-year graduation rate, and what we like to talk about is a 6-year completion rate. And that, for us, the difference between graduation and completion is if you complete, you might complete somewhere else. You didn't graduate from where you started, right? So that's one of the things that we emphasize in our reports. And it's you know, the problem is that it's still not widely accepted. There are a lot of institutions that voluntarily publish their total completion rates through the Student Achievement Measures project that comes from APLU, SAM, and there are about over 600 institutions now that use clearinghouse data to show, okay, fine, here's our IPEDS graduation rate, might only be 50%, but if you count the students who transferred and finished somewhere else, it's 65%, and you can see how many are completing at different types of institutions. Another look, though, is that if you take all the students who started at 2-year institutions, so that first bar chart that I showed you for community colleges was about students who started a community college and graduated somewhere within 6 years. Let's widen that view a little bit and say, what about the total cohort of students who started at a community college? Where did they end up 6 years later, right? Including the ones who didn't graduate at all. And that's this top part. 45% of them after 6 years, have no completion anywhere and no continuing enrollment, at least in the last year, in that 6th year. So these are people who have either dropped out completely or they've stopped out for at least a year and they've got nothing to show for it, right? 45%. Another 16.5% are still enrolled, right? And if we come all the way down to here, well, 20% completed an associate's degree at their starting institution and stopped, they're done. Another 6% completed the associate's degree and then went on to finish a bachelor's degree within 6 years. And these 9% never got an associate's degree but transferred and completed at a 4-year institution, right? So if you put all of this bachelor's degrees together, that's these two pieces, you've got about 15%. So if you think of the total pathway of students, you're talking to a student right out of high school, and they say, I want to start at a community college, and my goal, I don't really care about whether I get an associate's degree or not. My goal is to get a bachelor's degree. What are my chances? Right? 15%. That's the national average for all community college starters finishing a bachelor's degree within 6 years. Now, maybe 6 years is not enough. When we look longer, we see more. There's another 16.5% who are still enrolled. But of those who haven't completed within 6 years, the majority, 3/4 of them up here, are not even still enrolled. So the increment of the increase that this number might go up if we went out to 7 years or 8 years is not huge. Of course, not all of those students who started at community college are seeking a bachelor's degree. We don't really know. That's one of the harder things about looking inside those cars. What are students' goals and plans? Most students, as you probably know, who started at community college, if you ask them, when we survey, about 80% will say they have an eventual goal of earning a bachelor's degree. And that's been pretty consistent for years.
Are you asking students,
We don't.
these students who are seeking 2 years or moving on to a 4-year, what about students enrolled in a community college who are seeking certificates? Is
Yep,
that included?
absolutely. That's a big part of, I think, this chunk. There are a lot of students who start at a community college with no intention of getting any degree. They're looking for workplace skills and certifications or third-party certificates or licensures that are not going to be awarded by any post-secondary institution. And for the most, so one thing that we do to try and filter those students out is we only look at, we try to identify enrollment behaviors in this study that signal a kind of intent to pursue a degree. And those signals are if you were enrolled full-time for at least 1 term in your first year, or if you were enrolled half-time for at least 2 terms in your first year and a half, we consider that a kind of indicator of degree completion intent. That's about the best that we can do with clearinghouse data because we don't have information about specific courses. We don't have information about how many credits you're actually attempting or completing or what types of courses those are. So there's a lot of uncertainty in here. Yeah. When we think about student access and success, so student mobility and transfer is a big part of that, particularly for underrepresented students and students who are not well served by the, as I said, by the traditional model. So low-income, minority, first-generation students, certainly when we think of the traditional age students coming out of high school, are are more likely to begin at community colleges. And increasingly, the community college option is becoming more prominent for financial reasons because of concerns about affordability, about student debt, and all the ways. So it's not just about starting at a community college for academic or kind of personal reasons about wanting to stay closer to home or not sure if you're ready for a four-year commitment right out of high school, but students who simply say, I need to save money. Students, this is kind of another way to look at it. So I talked about students who started at community college and students who complete an associate's degree and students who finish at a bachelor's institution. But if you say, how about if we change the starting line to students who actually transfer, right? So that kind of gets at your point of, sure, a lot of those students have no intention of transferring, right? So if you start with students who actually transfer, they started at a community college, and I say, everyone who, for the first time after enrolling in a community college, they showed up at a four-year institution in a given year. That's my starting cohort, the transfer cohort. That group is relatively successful. 62% of those students will complete a bachelor's degree within 6 years after transferring. 6 years after transferring.
After transferring.
6 years from the point of transfer, right?
So, yeah.
Yeah, 62%. And I'll give some more details about that later on, but that's pretty encouraging. So you can say to a student, if you actually make the transfer, right, your odds are pretty good of continuing to complete that degree. And we increasingly have states and systems that are looking at processes for simplifying the kind of reverse transfer of credit as a sort of a backstop for those other 38% of students who do transfer but never complete the bachelor's degree. Have they accumulated enough credits at the combined 2-year and 4-year experience to at least go back and get an associate's degree if they didn't have one when they transferred? And most of those students who transfer, by the way, do not have an associate's degree when they do. They go without an associate's degree. So this kind of gives them a little bit of a backstop that they're not going to end up with nothing if they fail to get the bachelor's degree. There's also a lot of lateral transfer. Students going from 2-year to other 2-year institutions and from 4-year to other 4-year institutions. And many students who start at community colleges, we observe this kind of swirling enrollment behavior where they take courses at a community college after starting at the 4-year and transfer those credits back to their starting institution, both during the summer and during regular terms. And that has effect on their completion outcomes. So when we did a full kind of look at this, at an entire starting cohort of all students who started college anywhere in the U.S., 3.6 million students in fall of 2008, and we measured all their instances of changing institution. So you started at one college at some point within the next 6 years, and before you earned a degree, were you enrolled at a different college and no longer at your first college? So not a concurrent enrollment, but you're somewhere else. And what we found was that 37%, almost 2 in 5, had changed institutions at least once in 6 years. Almost half of those changed institutions more than once. Right? So, and that might be a swirling where you went to another institution and then came back. That we counted that as 2, or it might be a 3-step path from one institution to another institution to yet another institution. 19% of those, so this is 19% of the 37%. A fifth of the students who transfer will actually transfer 3 times or more. There's a lot of, that's going back to that highway interchange, there's a lot of on and off ramps, people coming in and out in many different directions. If you count all the transfers in and out, over half of all students on a typical campus at any point in time are what we would call mobile. They've either come in from somewhere else, or they're going to go to some other, they're going to transfer out to somewhere else. So if you think of all the students who are on your campus, 37% are just the, 37% of the ones who started there are mobile, but now you have to also add in all the ones who didn't start there, they started somewhere else and got to your campus, they're already mobile. So it's a total on average of a half of all students who you see at any point in time are on a kind of mobile pathway or a transfer pathway. And if you count all those multiple moves, these 3.6 million students made 2.4 million transitions from one institution to another. So you think of how many transfers did they actually make. It's a huge amount. Yeah?
Do you have that broken down between rural and urban?
That's interesting. We have not done an rural and urban. Not for this particular report. We have there's another report that we recently did with Teachers College and the Aspen Institute looking at transfer pathways. It was just published in January, and I don't have those results, the specifics of those results here, but there we did compare different rates of transfer and success for students at rural and versus urban community colleges. We actually looked at different types of community colleges and different types of four-year institutions and the combinations of those in terms of how many students were making the transition and doing it successfully. And rural and urban was one of the categories we used for the community colleges, and then for the four-year institutions we looked at selectivity and public and private and those other characteristics. So there is some information there about it, but this one we wouldn't do that. Okay, so there's a lot of transfer and mobility going on, and that 37% is actually pretty consistent for students regardless of what type of institution they start with. Even if you, with the exception of the for-profits, so even students who start at four-year institutions, nonprofit and public, it's well over a third of the students are mobile. Again, students who started those institutions. And for two-year institutions, it's a little bit higher, right? Particularly when you add that small sliver at the top of students who are transferring from a community college with an associate's degree, right? That's a pretty small chunk, though. If you look at all the students who started community college and transfer, it's kind of surprising how few do it with an associate's degree in hand. And that's why things like this passport are so important. Because it's a signal. These students don't have that kind of packaged signal of what they've done and what they are ready to do when they transfer, right? So one of the things that's really exciting to us about being a part of this passport initiative is being able to, in the coming years, really expand this kind of analysis where we can look at students who transfer with a passport and what are their success rates versus just with and without an associate's degree. Of all the students who changed institutions, about a quarter also went to a different state when they went to a different institution. Right? Their second institution is in a different state from their first institution. And that's highest for students who started at a private nonprofit four-year institution. 43% of those are actually, when they transfer, transferring into a different state. Now some of that, but not much, is summer swirl. So if you think of a student who is maybe going to a selective national four-year private institution on the East Coast, and during the summer, after their first year, they come back home and try and pack in a calculus course at the local community college, right? That would count up here as a transfer out of state, right? And it's lowest for students who start at two-year public institutions. Probably not surprisingly, most of their transfers are within state. They're going to, if they're starting at a two-year community college, they're probably already local, and they're probably staying relatively local when they go to another community college or to a four-year institution. But this varies a lot by state. So if you look at the community college students, sorry, that 19% who crossed the state line overall, here it is broken out state by state, and I've highlighted the witchy states. And it's pretty surprising how they congregate at the high end, right? I mean, Wyoming, Idaho, North Dakota, they're all well over 30%, a third of the students who are crossing state lines when they transfer. And that's probably not surprising to any of you, just given the structure of the higher education systems in those states, and what are the opportunities that are available to the students, and the relative mobility in Western states. The outlier in that group, of course, is California. Well, one, there's no need to ever leave California, right? There's thousands of institutions there. That's what they think, right? And they have very strong kind of articulation and transfer pathways within the state. So that's a big reason why a lot of these students are staying in state. But I think we're likely to see these patterns change as we look at the results of the Passport Initiative. And that it's likely to open up even more opportunities for students who are in some of those states that don't have so many options. By the way, if you don't see your state in here, that means we either don't have enough institutions in your state to be able to separate them out, or those institutions have not been participating in the clearinghouse for long enough for us to be able to build a sufficient cohort of students for this particular report. Okay, I talked a little bit about enrollment behaviors. We also make a big distinction in our research at the clearinghouse about students' enrollment intensity, that we try to expand on the notion of a full-time student. Because again, going back to that, the IPEDS rates and the numbers that you see in college rankings and scorecards, they not only focus only on the traditional first-time student, but they also focus on the traditional full-time student. And what they mean by a full-time student is actually very limited. If you were enrolled full-time in your very first semester, very first term of college ever, you are a full-time student. And you are part of that full-time cohort forever. Even if the very next semester you change to part-time and you are part-time from then on, you're counted and measured as if you were a full-time student. That's why they can kind of get away with that 6-year cutoff for a 4-year degree, because they say, well, these are all full-time students. Well, in fact, when you look at the numbers, many of the students who take 6 years or 5 years to graduate, they're clearly not staying full-time, right? And the question of how you talk about a pathway for a student who, for nowadays, I think one of the most common reasons for students not staying full-time is financial. Students are seeking part-time jobs, full-time jobs, sometimes multiple jobs, to try and continue to be able to afford whatever institution it is that they're enrolled in, so they end up dropping to part-time at some point. And we find actually that almost half of all the students who start full-time don't stay full-time. almost half of all the students who start full-time don't stay full-time. And it makes a huge difference in their completion rates. Obviously, if you're only enrolling part-time, you're not going to finish a 4-year degree in 6 years. You're probably not going to finish a 2-year degree in 3 years. And it also makes a big difference in your likelihood of transferring. So we call those students mixed enrollment. Those are the students who have a combination. If you track them over time, they've got some part-time, some full-time. They might have started, most of them started full-time and later went part-time. Some also go the other way. The students who enroll exclusively full-time, meaning every time they enroll in our data, with the exception of summer terms, we don't count those for this measure, they're always full-time. So all the regular academic terms, when they are enrolled, they're full-time. That doesn't mean they didn't stop out, but when they're on campus, they're full-time. Those are exclusively full-time students, and exclusively part-time. And many people are surprised by this because they assume that the part-timers are the most mobile. Right? Those are the kind of occasional students, they're bouncing around, they've got all kinds of things going on. No, they're by far the least mobile, the least likely to transfer. Full-time students, 23% of those are transferring or changing institutions. Right? So if you're thinking of students who start at a community college and they're full-time, they're probably the ones who are most likely to be headed for a 4-year institution. So that's maybe understandable. But if you think also of the students who start at a 4-year institution, this is everybody together, right? And then this mixed enrollment group, that's the most, far and away, over half of those students are changing institutions, right? And I think that a lot of these factors are interrelated. So many of the reasons that students are part-time is because they're older students, they're working students, they have families, they have they're all the reasons that make students actually geographically constrained, if you think about it, right? They're the least geographically mobile because they've got homes and jobs and families. They're also the least likely to transfer and the most likely to enroll part-time. So those things are all connected, and there's not really any kind of, I'm not trying to suggest any cause and effect here that students who are, you know, that part-time enrollment is a cause. Veterans are also 2 to 3 times, they're the exception because they're much more mobile than other adult students and other part-time students. And I think part of that is actually a different level of geographic mobility for veterans and a different level of, you know, they're often in the reserves, they're getting called back up, they're having to stop out, and when they come back, they're in a completely different place. And so we see very different patterns compared to other adults. And these mixed enrollment students, again, over half of the cohort, I think also mixed enrollment is often as much a result of student mobility among institutions as it is a cause. That when you make that transition from one institution to another, it's often because there are other things going on in your life, and those things are also at the same time causing you to change to part-time or full-time enrollment. Destinations. What's interesting here is that, so here we're looking at where you started at a 2-year versus 4-year institution and where you go. Did you transfer to a 2-year or a 4-year institution? And there's a couple of surprising things here. One, students who started a 2-year institution, well, let's go here actually. Students who started a 4-year institution are equally likely to go to another 4-year, to go to a 2-year or another 4-year institution. Most people think if you started at a 4-year, you're going to transfer, and you transfer, you're changing to another 4-year. Half of them are going to another 2-year. And students, even students who started a 2-year, 15% are transferring to another 2-year. Right? 2-year institutions are as much a destination as they are a starting point for student mobility. Right? And when I add in these two other kind of exceptions to our common notions of student mobility and transfer. The students who start at a 4-year institution and go to a 2-year institution only during the summer and then come back to where they started, these summer swirlers, they're a pretty small chunk of that 17%, right? Relatively speaking, that's not what we're talking about here. These are students who are transferring to a 2-year institution for program reasons, for fit reasons, for affordability reasons. It's not just about that summer swirl. And again, this post-associate's degree part of the 2-year to 4-year transfer is really small. Right? If we go the whole hog and show all the different destinations based on where a student started to the type of institution that they enrolled to. If you started at a public 2-year, this is 100% is the student, all the students who transferred, right? So I'm breaking down, if you transferred, where did you go? Another public 2-year institution, a 2-year, these are very small slivers, 2-year private, for-profit, and nonprofit. There are very few of those institutions. Most of them are going to a 4-year public and 4-year private nonprofit, right? Even students who start at a 4-year public and a 4-year private nonprofit, here are the students, here are the percentages that are going to a 2-year public, and down here, the parts of those that are summer swirls, right? So again, it's very small. And here are the ones who are going to other 4-year institutions, right? So this is a complex picture. There's a lot more to it than the traditional transfer. And so it's kind of important to understand that, you know, student pathways, students are engaging in higher education in whole different ways. And this is again, 37, this is a breakdown of that 37% of all students who start. These are the kind, this is just their first step in the path, from their first institution to their second. And then another, what was it, another third of 45% of those have yet another move to make before they complete a degree. And they do it at many different points in time. So students, the transfer, if you look at students, the blue is students who start at a 2-year institution, and the orange is at a 4-year institution. When did they make that first transfer? Was it after their first year? Some. Second year? Most, right? Particularly if they're starting at a 2-year institution and going to a 4-year institution, right? But look how many are transferring for the first time in year 4, year 5, year 6, right? It's really different from what you expect. It's not just the traditional student, and it's not even the traditional transfer student. These are students, most of those I would say are students who have some stop-outs, or they've got a lot of part-time enrollments, right? And so it's not until the 4th or 5th or 6th year. And if you think about what that means in terms of advising and planning, to how do you talk about when you're talking to students when they show up on your doorstep in their first year, right? About what it might look like if you don't make that transfer for 4 or 5 years down the road. It's a whole different ballgame, yeah.
So those are actual years, not years worth of credits?
Yeah, these are actual calendar years. Yep. Calendar years. All right, we'll talk a little, yeah,
You don't have a chart like that for 4-year public students.
I do. Not in this
Not with me,
presentation.
unfortunately.
Not in this presentation, but,
Is
so
it
if you
different?
look at the report that this comes from, and I can show you a link for it, we've got this chart for every single type of institution in that big messy chart that I had, right? Students who started at each type. And in fact, you can do this for what type of institution did they go to, what type of institutions did they start in. Okay, we'll talk now, I'm going to shift gears and talk about what are the odds of success for these different pathways. Transfer and mobility are common, little understood, and often difficult to do. We know that among students who say they intend to pursue a bachelor's when they start at a community college, right? and who complete 60 or more credits at a community college, only 60% of them actually make the transfer to a four-year institution. You started at a community college, you said you wanted to get a bachelor's degree, you completed 60 credits at the community college, you still only have a 60% chance of actually enrolling at a four-year institution. That's pretty staggering. And when they do, 40% of those who do transfer lose more than 10% of the community college credits, 14% lose more than 90% of their community college credits. So this is not from the clearinghouse. That's why this is this Monahan and Atwell study. Because again, the clearinghouse doesn't know about credits. We just know about enrollments. But it's really telling, right? That credits is the issue for most of these students. They lose a lot of credits. They lose momentum. They lose money. It's a serious challenge to this pathway. This we already talked about. So the biggest barriers to success for transfer students, in my view, they're practical and behavioral. They're not structural. Right? It's about about finding better pathways so that students understand what credits are going to transfer ahead. That's the big challenge, right? Taking the right courses to begin with. When you don't really know if you're going to transfer or where you're going to transfer, how can you make sure that the courses that you're taking now will go with you? That's the biggest challenge to success. And when we looked at this, so this is our study where we took all the students who started at a community college and transferred. We said that's our starting point. All the students in a given year who first showed up at a four-year institution after as a transfer student in a given year. And we gave them 6 more years, and we said how many completed a degree. So this is the source of that 62% number. First off, where did they go? More than 2/3 went to a public four-year institution, right? That shouldn't be any surprise. Another 1/5 go to a private nonprofit, and a 1/10 to for-profit institutions. 62% completed a degree at a four-year institution. Another 8 are still enrolled after 6 years. So you've started at a community college, transferred to a four-year institution. 6 years later, after transferring, you still haven't finished the bachelor's, but you are still enrolling. You're still plugging away. These are dedicated students. These are determined students, right? That could be 8 years in. It could be 9 years in. So, the problem is not that these students are not committed, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all these other things that are slowing them down. A very small number are still enrolled, but back at a 2-year institution or at a different 2-year institution, and then a quarter have apparently dropped out or stopped out without any completion of the bachelor's degree, okay? If you transferred with an associate's degree, there's a big difference versus transferring without an associate's degree. This is pretty startling it's not startling that you're more likely to complete a bachelor's if you have an associate's when you transfer, right? But it's startling when you go back to the numbers of students are twice as likely, this group, this cohort over here, is actually twice as big as this cohort, almost twice as big, right? The majority of students, almost 2/3 of them, are transferring without an associate's degree, even though their odds of success are a lot lower. I'm sure that most of them don't know about their odds of success because these data don't exist outside of the clearinghouse, right? How many of you know, for students who transfer, if you're a four-year, into your institution with versus without an associate's degree, what the relative completion rates are? How many of you, if you're at a community colleges, know the relative completion rates for your students who transfer out with versus without an associate's degree? So, how do you talk to your students about that? How do you help them as an advisor to make intelligent pathway plans and decisions, right, about where to go, what are your odds of success at the local public four-year versus a private nonprofit versus a for-profit, and whether you should stay and complete the associate's degree or jump ship after 1 year. Here's the same thing for the destination institutions. So whether you've transferred to a four-year public versus a four-year private nonprofit or a four-year private for-profit. And here, at least we can say that the majority of students, this is by far the biggest group, are following the most successful path, right? They're transferring to a four-year public where their odds are slightly higher for completion compared to a four-year private nonprofit. But if you think about the information of student trying to make that decision in conjunction with an advisor, if you're advising a student where should you go to maximize your chances of completing the bachelor's degree, what would you say? You would probably say, well, everything we know about graduation rates is those IPEDS numbers. And they all say, nuh-uh, your chances of completing are higher here, right? Because graduation rates for students at four-year private nonprofits are higher, significantly higher than for students at four-year publics. Graduation rates, IPEDS graduation rates, first-time, full-time students who finish at the same institution where they started within 6 years, right? We don't have a way to talk about this as a communications point, as an advising point for students, as a planning point for students, right? If all students did was look at the published data, they would think their best chances were to go to a private nonprofit. And the difference is not huge. And chances are, if they can get into a very selective private nonprofit, I'm lumping all the private nonprofits in here, their odds are better, right? But overall, just in this big view, that's why understanding these numbers are important, and understanding these numbers for not just the big national average, because there's tons of, as you saw, state variation in here, tons of variation in specific institution types, right? But understanding for your own institution, for your own students, and your own kind of transfer partners, right? What are your students' odds of success if they go to, of the 3 or 4 campuses that you exchange the most transfer students with, which ones have the highest chances of success? Those are things that you can identify through clearinghouse data. Similar differences for timing of transfer. If you wait a year or more after your community college enrollment before you start at a four-year institution, you're significantly less likely to complete a bachelor's degree. Stop at, essentially. This is the losing momentum thing. That shouldn't be a surprise, but it's an interesting distinction. All right. Among all, this is now going back to not the transfer cohort, but among all the students here, all the students who earn an associate's degree, right? If you start with that as your base, all the people who earn an associate's degree, how many of them go on to complete a bachelor's degree, right? So there's a lot of them in there who never even transfer. If they transfer, we know they have a 62% chance. If you include even the ones who don't transfer, you've got 41% going on, and there's a big difference by age. So younger students are, if you earn an associate's degree, 61% likely to go on to transfer and complete a bachelor's degree. And the older you get, the lower those odds get. Okay? So this is the odds of transferring and completing a bachelor's degree, if you have an associate's degree. And again, there's a huge variation among states on this. So I've again highlighted witchy states, but you can see that Utah, Washington, Idaho, this is these numbers are significantly above the national average. Right? So students who complete an associate's degree in those states are more likely to go on to complete a bachelor's degree than students who complete an associate's degree in Montana, Alaska, North Dakota. Right? So the associate's degree is much more often a kind of terminal degree for those students.
I have a quick question
Yep.
from the South Dakota perspective. We don't have like a community college system. We do have some technical institutes though. I'm just wondering, are you including those?
Yeah, so,
Yeah,
right,
they
when I
have
say
to.
community college, this is all two-year public
Okay,
institutions.
great,
Yep.
thank you.
So that's very likely, that's what's going on there, yep.
Okay.
Okay. And the trend on this is, the trend on students who are kind of following this pathway, if you think again of the whole pathway, starting in community college and completing a bachelor's degree. So if you've got students where that's the goal, right? You're trying to talk to students and families about what are their odds of success, how well does this kind of process work? If I want to start college at a community college and my ultimate goal is a bachelor's degree, regardless of whether I get an associate's on the way, regardless of what type or how it all pans out, just from start to finish, end to end, the odds are actually declining over the last 3 years. So what you see here is two things. One, the number of students who are, at least in theory, pursuing this pathway has been ballooning. This is this red line. Whereas about 800,000 in fall 2007, 800,000 students started at a community college. First time ever in college showed up on the doorstep of a two-year public institution. In fall 2009, that had gone up to 1.1 million. That's a huge growth, right? And why? That's all about the recession, right? So there's a lot of things going on in here. This is different types of students. They're arriving in different types of institutions because there's a lot of, essentially, this growth in the cohort is causing overcrowding, all kinds of strain on those institutions. There's a lot of increasing concern, increasing affordability issues. These students are typically older. Many of them are coming to college because they're recently unemployed. So they haven't been on the academic trajectory. Lots of reasons why this might be happening, but we haven't been able to talk about this phenomenon because we haven't even measured it. And it's nowhere in, again, it's nowhere in the official government statistics. How many of these students actually ended up with a bachelor's degree 6 years later? And the percentages, for students who started in fall '07, it was 18%. We're now down to 15%. Right? So the odds of successfully completing that trajectory have declined steadily for these cohorts.
But you're
Yeah.
not including, are you including the seniors, the high school students who are enrolled in community colleges?
This is everybody.
Everybody.
Every student whose first ever enrollment in college was at a community college in this year. That's the starting cohort. Right? You started at a community college and you meet this criteria that I talked about for being degree seeking, meaning you had at least one full-time enrollment in a term in your first year, or you had at least 2 half-time enrollments within your first year and a half. So you're not just, we're trying to filter out the kind of casual students, the student who's just taking one course. They're not going to be in this group. Okay? Yeah.
When you say associate's degree, do you include associate of applied science as well, which are criminal? Or are you
Yes.
just talking about
No, I'm including-
degrees intended for transfer?
No, not, this is all degrees from the community college, regardless of whether it's a transfer degree or not. Yeah. Yeah, so again, there's a lot being mixed in here. But the basic pattern is the same, even for traditional, so, you know, a big part of that is older students. This cohort growth, most of that is adult students, right? well, if we look at it, when we break it down for different types of students, you see the same overall pattern that the cohort is increasing and the completion rate is decreasing in every one of these, right? So even for traditional age students, right, the decline is not quite as great, but it's there. The growth is not quite as great, but it's there. 20 and under traditional age and exclusively full-time. So these are the most kind of traditional students of this cohort, of this group, right? You still see growth in the enrollment rates and decline in the completion rates. The biggest growth in the enrollment rates is this group, the adults. So these guys are going from about 130,000 up to 300,000, almost triple, right? Huge growth in that group. But the fact is, again, this is a perspective on the way that students are engaging in higher education that we just haven't had a way to talk about because these numbers don't exist. And so I kind of have to ask how we have served these students as a nation, as a system, right? Not just talking about two-year institutions on their own. Again, we tend to focus on what each individual institution is doing, but with transfer students, you have to think about how is the whole post-secondary education system doing. And this was, in one way to think of this, is this was a huge opportunity. This is what you do in a recession. You invest in infrastructure, right? Why? Because interest rates are low and you have a lot of unemployed people, right? So you borrow lots of money and you invest it in the, right? Same thing could be said about higher education. We had lots of unemployed people and we had this huge opportunity because they were all coming to college. Many students who we had never seen before, right? So this was, if you think of higher education collectively as an enterprise in the United States, we just had a huge influx of customers, right? If we were Amazon.com and all these brand new customers came to our website, man, we would have taken advantage of that, right? Like, this was our chance to really do something about, one, reducing inequity and increasing opportunity and academic opportunity and increasing academic or post-secondary attainment in the U.S., right? This was our big shot. And if you look at these numbers, it's like, we didn't take advantage of it. For a lot of reasons. Huge cuts in state funding. We weren't able to borrow money at those low interest rates. That's not what colleges and universities typically do. We rely on tax revenues, and those were declining. So we had overcrowding. We had those students who came in had huge challenges around affordability. We saw a ballooning of student debt and loans. So students were, having to constantly reassess. I'm taking on all this debt, and what are my odds of completing a degree and getting a job with that degree when I finish? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Right? And they're asking that question every term when they sign up to register and pay that tuition bill. So there's a lot of very legitimate reasons. I'm not trying to, blame higher education here, but I think it's a fascinating way to look at what's been going on and think about how we might have done differently, particularly if we had, clearer pathways, better advising, better data, better information about what might lie ahead for these students, better ways to talk with them about their opportunities, about their trajectories, and their likelihood of success if they do option A versus option B versus option C. And maybe if they had passports. So that's where we are. Sorry we don't have much time for questions, but we had questions during the...
Does anybody have any questions right now?
I have more of an observation. It's
Yeah.
interesting because I know your intent is looking at graduation rates, so you're 6 years out and as you're doing the numbers. But our community college right now, our fall enrollment is down as of last year, 8%.
Yeah,
So we hit that high and
Yep.
now we're like
Yep.
going down
Yep.
there and we have no idea where it's gonna land. And one of the things we did is we built infrastructure to handle that enormous growth, and now we can't afford the infrastructure.
yeah.
There's like a quirky little thing going on, I don't know
That's-
how that's gonna shake out.
That's absolutely what's happened all across the country at community colleges. I mean, that surge of students during the recession was a phenomenon that we really had not seen. I mean, that was such a deep and severe recession. I mean, every recession you can see that if you look at the data. You know, the recession hits and nothing happens for 6 months to a year because everyone who's unemployed, they spend that much time looking for a new job, and then they say, you know what, time to go back to college, right? So it's like 6 months to a year later, college enrollments go up. Every single recession. But this recession, they went way up, really way up. There was so much talk about, you know, hey, the economy is changing, right? You need to up your game. If you're unemployed, this is not a recession where you're just going to hang out and wait for your job to come back. Your job is not coming back. You need a degree. You need skills. You need the human capital and training and credentials to be able to get the new jobs that are going to be created in the new economy, right? So there was a lot of that kind of people coming back looking for a way into the new economy. And one of the things we also track is just enrollments term by term at the clearinghouse. So we publish a current term enrollment report, and it's super clear when you look at the community colleges, especially the wave of students, particularly older students, coming into community colleges, and also for-profit institutions. And then in the last couple of years, we're just going right back down into the trough of where, as those students filter back out with or without having completed a degree, and as the economy recovers, they're being dragged back into the workforce.
Do you track the kind of programs that people are pursuing?
We don't yet,
What was
because
that question, Doug?
do we track the types of programs? Because we don't have that level of detail. We haven't had that level of detail in our data. All we know is you're enrolled at Monroe County Community College, half-time or full-time. We don't know about specific programs within that. Starting a year ago, some of the rules at the Department of Education about reporting for federal student aid purposes have changed, and they required colleges to actually provide specific program level information. So that information is now coming to the clearinghouse, so we know what program you're enrolled in, if it's a four-year institution, degree program, major, all those things. And so we will be able to start tracking that, but it'll be some years before we can track that all the way to completion for those students.